It's 6 o'clock. I think I'll get rolling. Can you all hear me on the mic? Good. All right. The first one of these meetings got canceled due to weather. The last one was a little bit more informal, but we're gonna tape tonight and maybe air it. So that's why the rest of the board has, or at least the board members that decided to show up tonight, joined me up here. Last time it was just me. So I want to thank you all for coming. The purpose of this meeting is to just give you some information about the referendum that's on March 19th. And I plan on, in my little, I don't know, I'd like to say it's 15 minutes, but it may go a little longer than that. Talk a little bit about the history of the cost-sharing method, how we got to where we got last year, the work that the subcommittee did, and then talk about the items that are on the ballot. Hey, Kyle. For any of you who did not get them, there's some informational handouts on that table back there. So I'm going to get started. I want to start talking about cost sharing in the context of the formation of the RSU. The RSU was formed, as you know, back in 2007, and there was a task force made up primarily of, can you still hear me? Okay. Carry on. Thank you. Made up primarily of community members. There were some board members on that task force, but at the time they were talking about trying to get ahead of the governor's initiative, and so they began to talk about some of the benefits of forming a consolidated school union. One of the items that they had talked about was cost sharing. How are we going to separate the costs within this district? There were other things that were discussed, things like governance. How are we going to redistrict? How are we going to share property? What are we going to do about debt? So in the formation of the district, it wasn't just about costs, although costs might be first and foremost on a lot of people's minds. Once the task force had met and saw some benefits to forming an RSU, that work was passed on to a transition team. That transition team worked out the nuts and bolts of how we were going to operate the district, and again, one of the things that they focused on was cost sharing. And the method that they looked at was dividing up the cost based on a third, a third, a third. 1/3 based on property valuation, another third based on student population, and the final third based on total population or census. Now, all of this was done prior to the election of the school board for the district. And I mention this only because cost sharing was not even a consideration for the board that got elected until we fast forward to May of 2008. And the board was elected in November. As we got into the spring, we started working on budgets, and it was presented to the board by the administration that we've got an issue. We don't know, the language is vague about how to apply the third, a third, a third. And we were basically given two options. David?
Tim, when you say administration, who was questioning the vagueness?
The superintendent. Yeah. The superintendent brought it to the board's attention. And it was just before a budget hearing. We were getting ready to present the budget to the communities, and we met in executive session. Essentially, we were told we had two ways to interpret the language of the law. either the third, a third, a third applied to the total budget, or the third, a third, a third only applied to the additional local. And what I mean by that is the state, most communities in the, or most school districts and communities around the state receive some kind of a subsidy. The way that the state generates subsidy for a community is they determine a minimum cost that a community needs to raise in order to educate their students. That's called the state required minimum. It's part of the EPS formula, which is essential programs and services. If a community does not have enough tax base to raise that minimum, then the state makes up the difference through subsidy. And we have 2 communities within the RSU who receive subsidy in that method, Bath and Woolwich. And so there was concern that if we did not raise the minimum that the state required, that for some of those communities, that there would be an issue with us receiving subsidy. There was a chance we may not receive subsidy from the state. So the board came out of executive session, we debated it, we voted on it, and we chose to go with the option where you apply the third, a third, a third to the additional local, and we go with the state method for the required local. As I said, it was a decision that was discussed in public by the board, it was voted on, and that was the method that the board used for 4 years in presenting to the public and billing the different communities. Then let's fast forward to last year. So Woolwich raised the question about how is the budget being apportioned. They had some questions about their assessment, and it led them to ask the question, how are we actually being billed? The board explained that, well, we follow the state for the state required local, we do the third, a third, a third for the additional local. They said that's not how we understood it, and there were other communities that felt the same way. They thought the third, a third, a third should be applied to the total budget. So the board had a number of public meetings to talk about it. We met with folks from different municipalities, and what the board decided to do, they felt the best way to resolve the situation was, given the fact that we were in the budget cycle again, we would hire one attorney, and whichever way that attorney sided in terms of interpreting the law, that's how we would go. We hired Brian Dench. He reviewed the information, and his interpretation of the law was that we should be applying, the school board should be applying a third, a third, a third to the total budget, just in the way that some of the municipalities felt. So that's how we did it last year. At the same time, because there was some discussion within the municipalities, we said before we get to the next budget cycle, we're going to form a subcommittee made up of, there's some paperwork on that table if you want, there's a little bit of paperwork on that table if you want to grab it. So we said we'll form a subcommittee before the next budget cycle. We'll have members from all the municipalities, 2 members, serve on that subcommittee. In most cases, they were all elected officials. And the hope is we will come up with a recommendation for a fair and equitable method of cost sharing that works for all of the communities. So that board started meeting in June, and we met about every other week. There were 2 board members on that subcommittee, myself and Julie Rice, who is no longer on the school board. And we tried to focus our discussions, or keep our discussions, to just a couple of key issues. What is fair for all communities? What is equitable? And as the discussion progressed, we focused on 2 factors that we felt should be part of a cost-sharing method. One was pupil count, and the other was ability to pay. So as we had these discussions and looked at different formulas, different kind of cost-sharing formulas, the challenge that we had was, what do you use as a measuring device to determine fairness and equity? How is one method or factor more equitable than another? And if you look, you can kind of get a sense of what we were up against. If you look at this sheet here, you can see how budgets have been divided up over the past 5 years and what each community is paid. If you look at West Bath, in 08-09 they paid $2.4 million, in 9-10 $2.5, in 10-11 $2.5, in 11-12 almost 2.6, and last year 2.1. When you look at those big numbers, it's really tough to tell, are we paying, is this fair and equitable? How does it compare to what other towns are paying? Are we paying our fair share? Are we paying more than our fair share? So what somebody in the subcommittee said was, let's try and divide these budgets up by pupil count, because that's something we all have in common. We all send children into the district. Let's divide up those numbers by pupil count and then get a sense of what we're paying relative to what another municipality is paying. Because again, what would happen is municipalities would look at these numbers, and the only way that they could really decide on fairness or equity is, am I paying more or less than I was the previous year? If I'm paying more, it's not equitable. If I'm paying less, it's equitable. So anyway, if you flip to the last page, you can now see those numbers at the bottom divided up by the number of pupils that the municipalities send, and looking at what each municipality paid on a cost per student basis. Again, the first 4 columns were the way the board did it using the state method, and the third for the required, the additional local. 2012, 2013 was applying the third to the entire budget. The point that I may have left out is throughout that 5-year period, we applied subsidy across the board. If a town was receiving subsidy, all of the towns benefited from that. So the subsidy that Woolwich brought in, Bath brought in, and also Rouseck and Phippsburg bring in a small subsidy. Those were applied across the total budget. So all the towns benefited from it. It kind of watered down the benefit that Bath and Woolwich felt from it. So, sorry, I lost my place here. So once we began to divide up the budget within the community and see it on a cost per pupil basis, some patterns began to emerge, and we could see for different methods that we were using, some towns benefited more than others. Some towns were paying more cost per pupil than others. So it was suggested within the committee that why not just take the total budget for the district, divide it by the total number of students, and then if your town sends 50 students, you pay 50 times the cost per student, and that's what you pay. If you send 200 students, it's 200 times the cost per student. And that way, every town essentially is paying the same amount per student. Whether you're from West Bath, whether you're from Phippsburg, Bath, Rouseck, Woolwich, we're all paying the same because we're all in the same district. So one town doesn't benefit over another. And that seemed to be a fair method of distributing the cost. The next question was, how do we deal with the ability to pay? Some towns do not have the tax base to pay that required cost that the state requires to send their kids, so they receive subsidy. So the way that we addressed in the committee handling ability to pay was to credit those towns that receive subsidy with the subsidy that they generate. They're bringing it into the district because of situations in their community. Under this method, they would benefit from that subsidy. So the committee felt that the cost per student method was fair and equitable, it addressed ability to pay, and it was fairly easy to explain, and it treated all communities the same. What I had asked as board chair was that the committee get us a recommendation by September so that the board could act on it. The committee came to us, reported in September, and said, this is a complex issue. We've been looking at this quite a bit. We need a little more time to work on this. In November, the committee recommended to the board 5-0 that we go with a cost per student method for 2014-2015. They unanimously voted we go with the cost per student method, but wait a year. When I met with the subcommittee, I said, what do we do about next year? There was a motion made that we stay with the third for another year. That was voted 2 in favor, 3 against. So somebody then proposed, let's look at going with the cost per student method. That was voted 3 in favor, 2 against. And I asked the subcommittee, can you please give me consensus, or I would prefer a unanimous decision, because we've worked on this, the subcommittee had worked on this for months and months and months. I didn't want to bring it back to a board that was just looking at this information for the first time. Ultimately, those were the votes that I got, and I did say I don't know what decision the board will make, but I know that we're going to not make all the communities happy with a 2-3 vote and a 3-2 vote. Yes, David?
Did you also a 4-1 vote, Ken?
There was a 4-1 vote. The 4-1 vote was in favor of doing the third, a third, and then going to cost per student the following year.
So 1 more year, does that make 2 years out of the proposed original 3 years of the LD 910?
No. Somebody proposed doing a third for another year, and then cost per student the following year.
Right.
The vote was 4-1. After the vote was taken, 2 of the members changed their vote. They said, if we can't get a unanimous vote, we're changing our vote. We retract our vote.
Just the point out, there was a 4-1 vote in favor of keeping LD 910 for 1 more year.
Right. And 2 members changed their vote within that vote.
Correct.
So I didn't want to complicate things too much.
Well, I just wanted to point it out, it wasn't all 3-2, it was 4-1 on 1 vote, didn't count.
Yeah, no, 3-2, 2-3, 4-1, 5-0. There were other votes taken by that committee as well. I'm just trying to be timely of, giving you a broad sense of what happened. So, I've talked about the ability to pay. I've talked about the cost per pupil method. Is there anything that I left out?
Just the vote from the board.
The board.
Oh, thank you. So the board voted, it came before the board voted unanimously to go with the cost per student method for this year, or for this next year. We felt if that's the direction that the municipalities ultimately want to go, why wait a year? We felt that if it was the most fair method to do, why wait a year? So the vote from the board was unanimous to go with cost per student, or cost per pupil.
Any abstentions?
Excuse me?
Any abstentions?
Did we? No.
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 You should have.
One member missing.
What's that?
One member was missing.
Okay. I don't have the notes in front of me, and I'll stand corrected. So there was a member missing.
The one that represents West Bath and Bath was missing.
Okay. But we have 2 members that represent West
Correct.
Bath. Okay. So, the referendum is the 19th. We encourage you to get out and vote. And I think I've covered it all. So I'll open it up to questions. Now, just out of curiosity, do we need to use the microphone for recording purposes?
To hear the questions, we'd have to have it.
Okay.
I can turn it off if you'd rather.
No? So if you have questions, I'd ask that you just come up to this mic.
We don't have to.
Oh, we don't have to? Okay, sorry about that.
Shut that.
All right, David.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you stated that the subsidy was spread across all the towns. The only year that the subsidy was spread across all the towns was this past year, when we went third, and third. The other years, you stated that we went by the EPS formula, which would show each town with their subsidy, and the extra local appropriation, we went with third. So in fact, only one year did we really spread the subsidy across all of the member towns. And you can correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm going to leave that.
We went by the state, the EPS formula. When you come out to the end, you get a figure for each town.
Right.
Which is what you guys used. That includes their subsidy. And then the extra local appropriation, we went the third, and third. This year, we went straight third, so the subsidy would have been spread out across the district, but not the prior 4 years.
Ruth, can you clarify that for me?
I think I have to disagree with you. The valuation and the cost per pupil were calculated, but we received subsidy as a monthly check every month for the 12 months of that year to a grand total, and it didn't get applied to each town. It got applied to the total budget. For instance, one year maybe we received $7.5 million in subsidy. It was generated by basically 2 towns, but those towns did not receive the credit for it.
They would have in the initial EPS funding formula. If I look at EPS today, if I look at the funding today, what the state says each town should pay, it shows that figure that we charge them with the subsidy included. So yes, you only get it once a month, you apply it but it's...
And just to let you know, Ruth Moore is the business manager for RSU1.
Think how to explain this. There is an amount that the state determined that was a required amount that each town had to raise in order to receive subsidy. But that subsidy was above and beyond what was required to be raised.
Okay.
If you look at one of the pages where it shows the warrant article, you're expected to raise for a total $21 million. But in order to receive $6.4 million worth of subsidy, your towns have to raise $15 million of that locally. If you raise that 15, you receive that 6.4. That 6.4 comes into the general fund just as a, 12 monthly equal payments into the general fund, but no town received individual for that 6.4. It was spread between all of them.
My question is, at that meeting in May, when you guys had, that which information was presented that Bath and Woolwich might lose their subsidy if we didn't do that?
May of 2008.
Okay, so
Yep.
you stated that if you hadn't made that change, that they may not receive their subsidy because of their, I don't know, whatever you
Yep.
said. So last year, when the whole budget was split up a third, a third, a third, did they lose their money?
No.
Okay,
Nope.
okay.
And we, again, the board, I mean, you now have a board that there's only 2 of us left from that original board, and it was 4 or 5 years ago, but I know that there were questions asked of the state about that, and we could never get a clear answer from them one way or the other. Are we going to get the subsidy or not get the subsidy? So, but we did, under the third, a third, a third last year, we raised the minimums that each community needed to raise, and we got the subsidy. So, any other questions?
It's afterthought here now, but at that time, when you changed it, you never had an answer from the state of Maine as to which way it would fall as far as Woolwich and Bath receiving subsidies? You made a vote without getting that information?
We had that information in executive session, or the board had that information in executive session right before a budget hearing.
But you didn't have an answer from the state?
Not at that, I don't think at that time, no.
And you made a vote with no answer?
Yes.
Huh.
Yeah. Go ahead.
In your history, I'm curious in the 2008 deliberation as to which way to interpret the third. Was there any legal opinion available as to the merits of one interpretation versus the other?
We were told that there were 2 legal opinions. One with an interpretation one way, and another with an interpretation another way.
Who told you that?
The superintendent.
Were those, it would seem rational if you were debating this issue, that you would have then brought forth the legal opinions to present to all the board members. Was that done?
Not that I'm aware of, not during executive session, not during the public vote.
How could you make a decision when there were supposedly legal opinions out that the board that is making the decision has not consulted the legal opinions?
It was debated about in public, and we were presented by the superintendent that we had a choice to make, and we made a choice.
Without any information as to the legal opinions?
The only information we had was from the superintendent. And again, let me just clarify 2 things. You're asking me because I was on the board that many years ago. This board, the composition, the folks here were not on the board. And I can't answer for the other 7 or 6 people that were on the board. The other thing is, certainly the board has a responsibility. And questions have been raised about the decision that we have made, you know, for a significant amount of time. The decisions that we made were made in public. They were voted on. They were part of public record, and every community that received a bill, both in the public meeting and subsequently, it showed how the budget was brought up. So if there were any issues with the decision that we made, those issues could have been brought up at that moment, and certainly as 7 public members, we may have re-examined it. The issue was never brought up. So
I would advance that if there were 2 legal opinions, contrasting or whatever, that should have been made very public. It should have been immediate consideration of all board members, and to not do so is a fiduciary malfeasance, but that I suspect is what is the court case is about, and perhaps we'll find out who the culprit is, but clearly there was an administrative lapse somewhere there in properly conducting their fiduciary responsibility, and that is my opinion, but we will see what happens. And hence, we are concerned.
And that may very well be the case. And again, the discussion tonight is about the referendum that's going forward in, a week or so.
I appreciate that, but note that such concerns bring to mind questions as to the integrity of the past board superintendent in particular, perhaps, and until those concerns are laid to rest with a proper explanation and perhaps due adjudication, it remains a concern that the administration of RSU1 is burdened with, and I would suggest that you folks should do your best to elucidate the situation and put that to rest, and the only way to put that to rest is have full factual information. But again, we hope that is what the court case will provide.
Sure, and all I can say is that's part of the reason we're having these public meetings, to discuss a method going forward. That's part of the reason why when a new cost-sharing method was examined, and we very well could have gone with the existing method, that there were 2 members from every municipality, they were elected officials, and they participated in that subcommittee for that 6-month process. So I'm hoping that this board, that this district, that this community has done their due diligence this time around. I'm hoping we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's. We'll see what comes out with the vote, and I can't say that we may not have overlooked something, but there's certainly been plenty of participation. Every one of those meetings with that subcommittee was public, and we've encouraged people to be part of the process. So, are there any other questions? Go ahead.
I got a question. From this point forward, it's my understanding that West Bath doesn't have a subsidy, and probably in the future we will not have a subsidy. So we're stuck in the position we are, that we're going to be paying more each year this comes about because of the formula and everything that's in the play right now. Is that correct?
It is, yeah.
And if that is so, then how is that supposed to be a fair way for you people to conduct business with all the towns involved?
Because the state generates the subsidy. The subsidy comes from the state. This group doesn't determine the subsidy. So in the state's infinite wisdom, through their formula, they feel that there are some communities that don't have the tax base to raise the dollars, where they've hit the max of the mill rate that they need to raise dollars for education. So the state says, you get a subsidy, you get a subsidy, you don't, you don't. And David, do you want to try and clarify that? I saw your hand go up. Go ahead.
I want to just offer a quick clarification to your response to the gentleman's question. It's actually not a foregone conclusion that West Bath will never get a subsidy. In fact, if West Bath all of a sudden starts sending more students to the district, such that their burden would exceed that threshold, which today is capped at 7.69%. If it were to come about that West Bath was sending that number of students and bore that load, then the state would make up, just as they do for Bath and Woolwich, would make up the difference betwixt the two. But the issue is, West Bath has a very high tax base and yet isn't sending a very large number of students into the system. So you don't hit that 7.69 threshold and therefore don't qualify today for a subsidy.
Well, one reason why West Bath has a very high tax threshold is because we had our valuation maybe a year or two just before the real estate bubble bursted. So if they went around and reevaluated us today, I'm sure we wouldn't be paying the taxes that we're expected to pay. But being that said, going back to my original question, checks in the mail, we don't know what's going down in the future. We can only go what's black and white right today on the table. Right now, we have no subsidy. But when this was all brought into view from day one, the RSU, being the first one in the state, being the prototype for everybody else, this is all for one for all, we're gonna help each other, all the cost is gonna be shared, but now that we've gone into it a few years, everybody's getting a share, but West Bath isn't.
No, that isn't true. I mean, in fact, again,
But without the subsidy,
there were municipality members that sat on the subcommittee. Every community is paying, under this method that we're looking at, that we'll be voting on, every community pays the same per student. It doesn't matter whether you're from West Bath, Phippsburg, or Rouseck, you pay the same cost per student. The only way that we, again, it was the committee's work. The subcommittee was made up of members of the municipalities. The only way to address the ability to pay issue was if a town is generating subsidy from the state, that they would be credited with that subsidy. Why should another town be credited with a subsidy that they didn't generate? So every town pays the same per student. In Phippsburg isn't paying for your students, you're paying for your students. Rouseck isn't paying for Bath students, Bath's paying for their students, and it's the same cost per student.
but yet Bath has more students than West Bath does, almost a 3-to-1 ratio. But because of the subsidy that's been kicked in, that lowers everything down, and the way everything all ends up, West Bath is paying more.
Per student.
Per student.
Yes. Yep.
But see, we're supposed to be all in this together, but the other communities aren't, we are. That's what the, you know, the cheese is binding here.
Again, if you want...
Do you see anything in the future where you might try to look at this and say, well, maybe there's something else we can do to make this a little more even feel?
We have made it, in what we're proposing, we have made it even. Every town pays the same. But certain towns generate subsidy from the state.
Okay.
That money goes to the towns. And as I said, that subcommittee that made the recommendation to the board was made up of members of all those municipalities, elected officials from all of the 5 serving communities. That's what they recommended back to the board, and that's the direction that we chose to go in. Ultimately, the vote falls with you. So, yes.
How often is RSU1 audited, and who has been doing the auditing?
We get audited
Every year.
annually, and the firm, we've had the same firm.
Runyon, Kirsten, and Relax out of South Portland.
Okay, any other questions?
Sorry, Tim. Can I just clarify for my own knowledge? Is it too simple for me to say that additional local is just the net amount after the EPS?
Yes.
Is that pretty a simplistic way to
Yep.
look at it? Okay, thanks. That's all I needed.
Yep. So Ruth, I don't know if you want to go through this sheet to show you, to show how the budget would be divided if we voted in favor of the cost per student method. You want to go ahead?
We'll all have the colored sheet. I just wanted to put something simple together to make you understand how the calculation will work. And I used the budget for the current year since we're still working on the new year. In this current year, our total budget was the $26,015,497. What we would do is subtract all of the miscellaneous revenues that we would have coming in that we have budgeted, such things as tuition receipts, gate receipts, any refunds, any little things that we have that, main care, things like that. Then we would also subtract the state-approved debt service payments that are coming to us from the state. That comes to us as part of the subsidy payment, but there's the vocational school that was a state-approved project and the new Woolwich school. So in this current year, we're receiving $407,000 for the vocational school and $1,000,004 for Woolwich. So we subtract that. I'm subtracting those figures because I know that I'm going to get those revenues from somewhere else, not from the local towns. And so now it comes down to the 23,400 that we need to find a way to raise. and I have no other revenues coming that I'm aware of, so I say, all right, this is what the towns have to raise. And looking at the enrollment down here in the corner, here's the enrollment for each town. I divide that figure by the total enrollment of 2,092 students to get an average cost per student of $11,189. And then I just multiply by the number of students per town to find out what those towns would pay based on the number of students that they have in that year. And as you can see, it adds up to the same $23,407,000 that's up above. So here we've raised the money by taking the 11,189 times the number of pupils and charged each of the towns their share. If you go to the second page, we're now going to look at the subsidy that those towns generate. It's either general purpose aid or special ed reimbursement. General purpose aid.
Excuse me, Ruth. There are two types of subsidies, right, as you just said.
Yes.
The special needs, that is a subsidy that West Bath will probably never receive.
That's my understanding. That's what I was told by the state, that they will never receive that.
That's what I was told also. So, in effect, there's a certain amount of subsidy, unless they change the rules in Augusta, that West Bath, even if we qualify for it now, will not receive.
Right, because the reason being is when we came together, West Bath actually did generate general purpose aid. I don't have that number in front of me, but they did generate a little bit.
20,000 a year or something.
And so the state's rule at the time is when you came together, if you were not generating that special ed reimbursement at the time that you came together, you would never get that. Phippsburg and Arousic were not receiving general purpose aid. They were getting that special ed reimbursement, and so as long as the state will continue to fund that, they will receive it. West Bath stopped generating subsidy because their valuation went up and pupils went down, and so they no longer generate subsidy. And so they're not receiving general purpose aid or the special ed reimbursement.
Right.
Okay.
On the subsidies also, are the subsidies for the schools, vocational center and Woolwich School, are they in a separate bin of subsidy?
Yes, they're part of this that got subtracted, and so the towns are not getting credit for that.
The towns get an EPS formula kind of related subsidy, and that's separate.
Yes.
Thank you.
The debt service is not part of this.
Yep.
Yes, Claire?
What about, isn't there a subsidy for at-risk or poverty for free and reduced lunch numbers?
That is all factored into the EPS formula. It's all part of it.
That's not in this subsidy that's being...
It's not a separate subsidy. It's all in the state's funding formula. It's all, there's like 3 pages of calculations, and they take all of that into consideration. So on this sheet then, Phippsburg and Arousic received those small amounts, and that's a calculation that, I don't know, it's 35% of the special ed reimbursement divided by the number of students. It's kind of a complex calculation. But the Woolwich and Bath, this is the subsidy that they generate above and beyond what the state says that they should be able to raise according to the number that they need to raise according to the number of pupils that they have, but based on their tax base and the state set mill rate. They don't have to raise that much. The state kicks in this amount of money. So taking the dollar amounts that the towns on the first page now have to raise and subtracting what the towns generate either through special ed reimbursement or general purpose aid, we now come up to what the towns actually have to raise. So if you divide, and I just showed these last 2 blocks, dividing this number here, obviously it's just a reverse multiplication division. Dividing this number by the number of pupils per town shows that every town starts out paying exactly $11,189 per student. Every town pays that. And then this last block is taking the amount after the subsidy has been applied to the town that generates it and dividing it again by the number of pupils, just to show you what they are raising at that point after the subsidy has been applied. So this is just hopefully a simple spreadsheet to show you how it will be calculated and how we can say that every town starts out paying exactly the same per student.
Any questions for Ruth?
I just have a question. As far as if this passes on Tuesday, when do you revisit population? Is that done every year prior to budget, or is it looked at, I mean...
The student population.
10 kids move out of town.
Right.
So when is that?
We're taking that in order to have this be a consistent thing year after year after year. The ED 279, the state subsidy form, has those numbers, which gets entered in the Infinite Campus module that, every school loads that up to the state anyway. So that we know where to go every single year to get those numbers, we're going to take it from the 279, which lists it by town. So we'll always go to that location to get the numbers.
But it's just one point in time, right? You don't update the numbers.
Right, you capture it once a year.
Right,
capture it.
right. Yeah.
Right, so it will be revisited every year.
Every year.
When that, I mean...
We're waiting for the 279 to come out now to be able to do this next year's budget. And that's where we'll also know what this subsidy number is once we get that 279.
It's based on October 1st and April 1st enrollments.
Yeah.
October 1st?
October 1st and
It's an
April
average.
1st. It's an average.
Any other questions on that formula? Any questions in general about the referendum?
If this doesn't pass, what are you guys going to do?
If this does not pass, we will do the third to the total budget.
Okay.
Without subsidy.
Without concern, it's a subsidy.
The subsidies will spread.
Just
Right.
back into the pile.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
They're saying the subsidy will go across the district.
So it'll go a third, just like we did last year?
Yep.
That's what we'll go with if it doesn't pass?
Right.
Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
I just like to say, part of your question also was that West Bass costs were always going to go up, right? I'm not sure exactly how you phrased it, but under the cost per student formula, everybody's vote rises at the same rate. So if the cost per student increases based on the district's budget, then all municipalities will see an increase in the cost. If the budget reflects a decrease, comes in lower than it has in previous years, then the amount that municipalities will pay will go down, will decrease. But it will happen equally across all the municipalities.
But West Bath not having any subsidies to help rely on like the other towns. We're always going to be right there.
Subsidy aside, everybody's cost per student is equal.
It's true.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you for all coming out. I had hoped to see more folks here tonight, as I stated at the last meeting. Many of you were served on that subcommittee, and I want to thank you for your work. And I encourage you all to get out and vote on the 19th. And if you have any other questions or comments, you can get in touch with central office, or you can email the board. All those addresses are listed on the website. So, thank you.
Thank you for coming by.